So let's get into some of the key takeaways from the series. There is so much to this. Right?
there is.
So much so that Reset spent the equivalent of like a few hours, maybe an hour or so, talking about the topic. And I know that there was an overarching theme here that you wanted to bring forth about race. And I wanted to see if you could talk more about that part.
Yeah, I think that fatphobia is fundamentally wrapped up in anti-Blackness and racism. A big piece of that is that Black women have often led the charge for fat acceptance movements. And those are movements that benefit everyone, that even thin people benefit when we dismantle some of our own anti-fatness, because, that helps people who are struggling with disordered eating and all other kinds of things. Black women tend to be leading those charges. And I think body positivity is a great example where fat Black women, started the body positivity movement. And a lot of where we see body positivity show up now is in thin white women on Instagram talking about body acceptance. Body acceptance of all kinds is really important, but I think that something that was coming up again and again for me and for the people I was talking to for this series, it's not just me, I didn't come up with these ideas on my own. Everyone I talked to was like, we have to make sure that we are centering fat Black women here. Because if we're not centering fat Black women, we're missing a huge piece of this conversation. And then another piece of that is, this relationship between fatphobia and anti-Blackness really comes from race science. So I actually want to let Mikey Mercedes, who we talked to for our last segment about healthcare, speak on that for a second.
The earliest scientists doing race science designated Black people as the most inferior race of people by talking about the pleasure-seeking nature of Africans as well as the fatness of their bodies.
So what we're talking about here is eugenics, basically, is that when white so-called race scientists were trying to distinguish between races and come up with distinguishing factors that, definitively proved that white people were in all ways a superior race, they really latched on to the fact that African women had bodies that by the beauty standards at the time were desirable and were beautiful. And so fatphobia was in some ways, and this is an oversimplification of, decades and hundreds of years of history that Sabrina Strings talks about a lot in her book. In her book, Fearing the Black Body, which is the racial origins of fatphobia. Fatphobia was basically used to reason away racism and then slavery, the slave trade. So there is sort of a centuries-long relationship between fatphobia and anti-Blackness that Mikey also went on to say in our interview with her that we see in healthcare today.
Yeah. That is really resonant. And I remember when I was listening to the conversation with Mikey, when it came up, I was like, oh, yes, it makes sense. I'm looking back at my family. I'm looking
You're like,
at,
wait a minute.
Yes, the conversations that I've had. And I'm like, okay. So I think I'm glad that we are kind of starting off with that point because I think your intuition is correct, is that it does permeate the entire fatphobia conversation.